I would like to introduce Nina Freeman and Emmett Butler, the creators of Sybil.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just going to switch over to our presentation real quick.
Thank you.
Thanks, Andy, for having us here. He's over there now.
Oh, perfect. Look at that. That's just great.
While he sets that up, I'm Nina Freeman. Hi. This is Emmett. Thanks to Andy for having us here. We're really excited to be here. This is a really cool space, and a bunch of our friends work out of this space, and we think it's awesome. So this is really sweet. And we're good.
Yeah, I guess we can just get started, right?
Yeah. So I'm, like I said, I'm Nina. I was the designer and project lead on this game called Sybil, which we'll be talking about in a minute. And the game came out last November, so we're a little past shipping it at this point. So we're going to sort of like look back on that whole experience. And right now, I'm currently working in Portland at Fulbright as a level designer on Tacoma. So that's what I'm up to right now.
And my name is Emmett Butler. I did most of the software development side of creating Sybil, and I work remotely for a company based out of New York called Parsley as a software engineer. And we moved here together so that Nina could work at Fulbright.
Yay. So as far as Sybil goes, Sybil, the team name that we have is Star Made Games. So I worked on it, Emmett worked on it. Also, we had other collaborators, Decky Koss, who did the music, Rebecca Dunlap, who did the art, Samantha Corey, who did the films, Noel at Fulbright helped us out a bunch,
We contracted
Sean
out a bunch of
Hogan.
stuff,
Yeah,
so
there was like a
so-
ton of different people that worked on this game sort of over the course of it. So thank you to them, shout outs to them. So now, just to get into what the game is, so for those of you who haven't played it or who aren't familiar, Sybil is a game about a girl who has a relationship with a guy that she met in an online game. So sort of like an MMO, massively multiplayer online game like World of Warcraft or something. And the player plays as Nina, the girl that this game is about, as she becomes closer with this lover until they decide to meet up in person to have sex. So this game is based on a true story drawn from things that actually happened to me, and I'll get a little more into it later because I don't consider it autobiographical, but it's more based on a true story drawn from stuff in my life. So now I'll show you the trailer just to give you a sense of what the gameplay is like. It's not on the screen. This was our release trailer. Morning.
Son?
Not much. Want to do a run together?
Yeah.
I kind of wish we lived closer.
Being on opposite coasts, best for hanging out.
Would you want to meet up with me, like, in real life? Okay, so that was our release trailer. So as you can tell, the game is about this couple. It's really focused on these two people, and they're pretty young. It takes place in 2008, and the two people are like, early 20s. She's 19, and you play as her using her computer as if you're sitting in her desk chair as her. So it's sort of a first-person game in that way. So you sit down as Nina and play as her. You click through her desktop, You look at all of her pictures, you look at her blog posts, you have access to all of the stuff that she would have access to as a person sitting at her computer experiencing this whole situation. And part of that is logging in to the online game where she interacts with the guy who she's sort of in a relationship. And his name is Blake, and his avatar's name is Ichi, so I might refer to him as both of those names periodically. So how did it start? I don't know if you have anything to add to any of that.
No.
Okay. We're going to be sort of talking conversationally through parts of this. So in the beginning, before Sybil was a thing, I was in Bennett Foddy's prototype class, prototyping studio class in 2013 at NYU while I was working on my master's. And I was in the integrated digital media program there. And this was a class where we made a different digital prototype every single week. So it was basically a game jam every week for a whole semester. And each theme every week was usually picked by Bennett. But one of the weeks, we sort of got to pick the theme on our own as a class. So I think there was a vote, but basically my friend Francisca and I thought it would be really funny to see what our classmates would make if the theme was sex. We were like, what kind of weird sex games would these people make? So we kind of forced that theme on the rest of the class. So given the theme of sex and a week to make a prototype, I started reflecting on what that might be for me. So when I was brainstorming, I decided to focus on my teenage years, and I often make games based on my own life, so that's sort of my default, is to like try and think of real stuff that I've experienced or that maybe someone I know has experienced and draw from that. So I was like, okay, teenage years are really crazy when it comes to sex, because it's just like madness, because you're just learning about it. So there was a lot to draw from there, and I came to the experience that Sybil was based on. My notes. So as I was reflecting, I came to this experience, and it's based on when I was playing Final Fantasy Online, so that was Final Fantasy 11, and I started playing that game when I was 14, so in 2004, and I played it until I was 19 in 2009, so I played it for a really long time. And when I was playing it, I was in this sort of flirtatious situation with this guy, and we did decide that we wanted to meet up to have sex. This all really happened, and he flew from California to New York City to meet me when I was 19-ish. And so Sybil is based on that scenario, loosely. So I want to emphasize that I consider, because people often call Sybil autobiographical, even though I don't call it that, so I always want to be clear. I think that it is based on a true story because it's not true to the moment-to-moment situation that actually happened to me in real life. I just used that situation as like a base for the story, and I built on that. So that's why I will use the term based on a true story rather than autobiographical, because I took this situation and shaped it into a narrative that made sense, rather than talking about my whole relationship with this guy, which isn't really interesting to anyone, including myself. Really, just this one snippet of it is the interesting part, and that's what I chose to build the game out of.
I think before you phrased it as you take something from your past and you kind of treat it as fiction.
Yeah.
In a way,
Mm-hmm.
you write it as a story of its own.
Yeah, I kind of am like, okay, there's this character, 18-year-old Nina, and she sucks, and then I go from there. For example, I'm not like, oh, this is me. I'm like, it's this other person, even though it's based on me. So that's kind of convoluted, but that's how I do it. So I'm going to show you the original prototype that I made in that class now, which is super embarrassing. Okay, I made it in Flixel. Yeah, you can grab it.
Panda, shut up. Lenore totally deserves the AF. She saved all of us on the last run.
She's a bitch.
Oh my god.
You can click on the ghosts.
Okay, well, you're lucky I like you, because that's...
Okay, he lost because he got killed.
Panda, shut up. She
You
saved
can't
all of us on
lose
the
in
last
Sybil
She's a bitch.
a major
run.
improvement
Oh
from
my
this prototype.
God. Okay, well, you're lucky I like you, because that's mean. I think the link jell's gonna disagree with you.
I'm the leader, so it's ultimately my decision. You can have a drop if you want.
No.
Suit yourself.
I hope Lenore's okay.
We're so different.
What?
I just don't care at all about how she feels, that's all.
I mean, no.
I would have given it to you if you wanted it.
That's really nice. Thank you.
When can we talk on the phone tonight?
Oh my god.
It's okay, that was the end. Thanks, Emmett, for
Yeah, I know.
soldiering through that horrible prototype.
That is my incredible voice acting, by the way.
Yeah. Yeah. I was voice acting. I also did the voice acting for Sybil, the one we shipped. I think I came a long way from that. So anyways, that was the prototype I made for Bennett's class. Literally, that's it. It's sex.swift on my computer. So I was pretty happy with it, even though it was like pretty scrappy. I mean, I made it in a week, so what are you gonna do? But I thought the concept was interesting to me and that I might want to pursue it. So with some encouragement from Bennett, my professor, I decided to flesh out this prototype outside of class, and ended up deciding to build it out as my master's thesis in school. So I decided that I would take this core idea and story of the couple meeting in an online game and deciding to have sex, etc., this sort of core concept, and I wanted to break it into a 3-act structure, with each act focusing on a different part of their relationship by having the player play as Nina in the online game while she chats and plays along with the lover, which is kind of what you just saw in this prototype. So I was like, okay, I have this prototype. I want basically 3 scenes like that have more stuff in them, basically. I wanted something more than just like a snippet of a conversation. I wanted that kind of structure, but more fleshed out. So when I had that idea down and I'd like kind of thought it through barely, I started asking people to work on it with me. So that's when I asked Emmett, Decky, and Rebecca to join me in working on it. And Emmett and Decky and I had worked together a lot before. We did How Do You Do It together and a game called Ladylike and a bunch of other games that we'd shipped. And this is actually Rebecca's first game ever that she'd ever worked on. So that was pretty cool. We were just friends. And I really liked her art, so I was like, please work with me, you're awesome. So we all came together, and I was the project lead, and I was just working on this for my master's thesis, so I was still a student. I don't think anyone else was a student at the time, right?
I was a student, but not for game design.
Yeah.
I was finishing up a CS degree.
Right, so we were all doing various things, but I was doing my thesis. And I want to note here that Sybil did start as a student project, and I think this is important because yes, you can be a student and start a project and ship a polished product and do really well for yourself. Being a student doesn't mean you have to release your work for free or that it's less valuable in any way. And I always just want to point that out because I think it's really important, because I think a lot of students just release stuff for free, but you can totally sell it, which is what I did.
But that said, it really helped us to have the practice of releasing a bunch of stuff for free before we tried to do that, because we learned a ton of, that's what this whole presentation is supposed to be about, is that we learned a ton of stuff that we never learned from just doing like weekend game jams.
Yep. Yeah, we had shipped a bunch of games together before and had put stuff on Steam, so we had a little bit of a basis, but this was like our first big thing. So despite the fact that myself and most of the team had shipped games together before, we weren't all that experienced with shipping something with this large of a scope, and we definitely weren't experienced with long-term game development projects. So we learned a lot about these things very quickly because we thought Cibele was going to be really small. I thought that the 3 scenes would be so concise that it would not be hard to make. But it turns out what we thought would be a small game wasn't actually very small and took us 1.5 years to make. So we thought it would just be about playing this fake MMO with your friends and your lover, like I was saying before, just like what I did when I was younger and kind of like what the prototype showed. Like it would have a very literal MMO interface with the chat and the UI and all this stuff. I had all these plans for how it would be like a simulation of that experience. But quickly I realized that the simulation kind of design wasn't actually helping the player understand the story. It was definitely contextualizing the MMO, but it wasn't helping them focus in on this relationship. It was mostly just distracting, because there was tons of UI and grinding, and it was just none of that really matters. It's really just about the story. So I decided to basically very quickly try and cut away the cruft of this simulation idea that I had initially had, and make it more about the characters. So during that process, I made a couple decisions, one being that we would need a desktop that the player would be able to explore in order to contextualize the story and the characters. So everything on the desktop needed to be really focused on communicating things about the story rather than just being like literally my desktop from 2008. So I decided on top of the desktops that we would need short films to help the player understand that they're playing the game as Nina, who is a human being with a body. So obviously this is a game about sex and about relationship and about two human bodies interacting with each other. So I felt that I wasn't going to get the same impact out of animation, so I wanted to do short films. That was good for this game. And I also decided that my 3-act structure that would somehow be supported by 5 maps, like a real MMO, didn't make any sense, because that's way too much, so I scrapped that idea, which was great. And we went with smaller maps and cut all the extra characters that had kind of come out in this idea of like simulating this experience exactly. Because at first, you know, when you play an online game, it's like you're playing with a bunch of friends, but in this game, the other friends don't matter. It's just about you and the guy. So I was like, okay, it's just gonna be these 2 characters and that's it. And at the end of that, sort of like, this is like a lot of information because it was really like that. It was sort of like a chaotic first couple months where I had all these ideas and was just like, we're gonna make this huge thing, blah.
The really funny part is that we started off with an idea for a huge game that we thought was gonna take a very short time to make, and halfway through the process, like months down the line, we had a relatively small game that we knew was going to still take a very long time to make.
Yeah.
Like completely 180 on that.
Yeah, but the original idea would have been impossible for a team of our size, given that we wanted to ever ship the game, you know, within a year at least. So we kind of had all this design iteration at first, just figuring out what the heck we were doing, and then I was like, okay, I have to write this thing now. So you might think I spent a ton of time writing and rewriting the script of the game and deciding what kinds of emails and images would go on the desktop and all this story stuff. And yes, I did spend a ton of time on it, but maybe not in the exact way that you'd expect. So the script came first, and when I say script in this case, I specifically mean the voiceover conversations between Nina and Blake that happened during the MMO sequences and also in the short films. So when I started planning out the script, I knew that I wanted the game to play out in 3 acts. That's something I sort of stuck with, despite the fact that we scoped it down a lot. And each act would consist of 1 conversation that would encapsulate a specific detail about how and why Nina and Blake decided to meet up to have sex. And I made this decision early on because I decided I wanted it to be a vignette game. So a game about a specific moment, sort of a character study, something very concise. So I decided that I would build a vignette out of 3 conversations. And I didn't want to explore anything really beyond this one moment in the relationship through those 3 conversations, because there's just too much there. Relationships are huge, complicated things, and like I said earlier, not every part of a huge, long relationship is very interesting, so I picked the interesting part to write about. And I think that if I had tried to make a game that captured the whole relationship, the story would have lacked focus. So I didn't want to go on that route. So I picked a specific moment, that of them meeting up to have sex. And once I had that topic nailed down, I got into the more granular details of what the 3 conversations would be and what details they would explore. And a big part of the research that I did involved taking out my old laptop that I used to play Final Fantasy Online on. This is a real screenshot of my old character. Her name really was Sybil. And so we took out my old laptop and it was kind of broken because I hadn't used it in years. But Emmett and I basically somehow got it working and ripped everything off of it onto a hard drive. And there I was able to sift through old screenshots like this and through old chat logs and stuff and a lot of screenshots of conversations that I'd had in this game, because I've always been a notorious archiver of my life and definitely took screenshots of chat conversations that I thought were dramatic. So I was like thinking like, do I put one of those on the slide? But no, because they're like real people and I would feel a little creepy. So this is like kind of one of the more innocent ones.
The funny thing we noticed about those also was that they seemed relatively innocuous from my perspective, not having been involved, and Nina was like, oh my god, this was so scandalous at the time, and I was just like, all right.
Yeah. So I had a bunch of these screenshots specifically saved from when I was in a relationship with the IRL Blake figure, and reading through those basically as research helped refresh my memory a bit, about a couple specific things. So one important thing was helping me nail down Blake's voice, because obviously I was writing him, and I wanted to write him as realistically as possible and as honestly as possible. I didn't want to just write my caricature of him. I wanted to be really true to his voice. So I went and found things that he actually said and used those as reference, so that I could get into the headspace of like, where is he coming from? This isn't a game just about me, it's about these two characters, and I'm gonna treat them both like humans. So I also actually interestingly found some YouTube videos that people had recorded of us, like, of our whole group playing the game together and like on Ventrilo, so I could actually hear real conversations we had. It was super weird that this was on YouTube, but I found it and I was like, what is going on? So then I did a lot of investigation into how I was actually living at the time that all this stuff happened. So what did my dorm room look like? This, who were my friends, what was my attitude, how did I speak, etc. Luckily, it was my freshman year of college, so I had tons of photos to go through, because, you know, I was like sending my family, like, oh, here's my dorm room, blah, blah, blah. So I had all that stuff. And at the time, I had been actively using AIM and GChat and stuff that would save archives of your chat logs, so I was able to go in and download all of that stuff and sift through it and try and learn what 2008 era Nina spoke like, and 2008 era Blake spoke like. So that research really helped me get into the headspace of this time period and these characters, and it was really important to me to be honest to the character of Nina and to Blake, because I think it would have been easier to like sort of write from my current voice, so, sort of like commenting on the relationship through the dialogue, but I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to write what it was like and write honest depictions of these characters without any of my own commentary. And I think that research paid off and helped me write those characters in a realistic way. So then I needed to populate the desktops of the game, because there's obviously a lot of desktops, the chat logs, the blogs, the photos, the selfies, etc. And I needed stuff for that. So I went onto the Wayback Machine, and I used to like do a lot of web design when I was a kid, like starting at like 13, I stole my dad's credit card and bought a domain name and set up like a WordPress site or something, and I made all these anime and video game fan listings. Of course, I have none of that saved personally, but the Wayback Machine is a miracle and has all of this stuff. So I went back and searched through all of my old websites and found everything that I could find on Wayback Machine and downloaded all of it. It was like Wayback Machine diving is what I started to call it. And I downloaded all these blogs and stuff I had. This is like my tag board for my site. They say Amy because my online name was Amy when I was 13.
Paris Hilton.
That's Paris Hilton. That's an icon I made because I made icons. I had an icon blog. And this is a real blog entry. And this is actually how I'd have to look at it. I'd like go to the page and it would be all blank because the CSS was all destroyed by the Wayback Machine, and I'd have to like view source or like highlight it and copy it. It was a mess, but I got through it all and it was super cool. So ultimately, gathering all this computer detritus that I'd left behind took me the entire year and a half of the process. I was adding stuff to the desktops of the game up until like a month before we shipped it. Because all that stuff is super important, all of the ephemera, because it's really there to contextualize the story. Because you can only get so much from dialogue. There's a lot of reading in between the lines that happens in Sybil, where you look at the desktop and that stuff informs the conversations, and then you're sort of piecing together in your head what these two are actually thinking that they're not saying. So I did a ton of playtesting around the desktop content, and basically would ask players like, oh, what do you think this picture means to the character? What do you think this blog entry, why is this here? Why would she save that? What is this saying? And over the course of the year and a half, I place tested that stuff a ton and edited and added and took away all sorts of stuff from the desktop in order to have everything there support the story in a clear way and to say something about the characters that was clear. Obviously, there was some stuff that didn't make it in, like I had saved this because I think it's hilarious. I made it in Photoshop when I was like 15. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. Like, I have all these memories associated with it, but I didn't have a reason to put it in the game because it doesn't actually say anything about the characters in this specific story. It might if I was making a game about how I used to do web design or whatever, but not about 18-year-old Nina having a relationship. Everything needed to be directly related to that. So I culled everything that wasn't related, even though I thought it was all really cool. An example of something that I did keep is this photo of me and my friend. And for me, this helps, when I was playtesting, this helps the player better understand Nina because it lets them see that she's a real person. see that she is with friends. She has friends. She's at the Met Museum in New York City, which you learn she lives in New York City. So it's got all this information in it that the player can understand as they listen to the conversations and learn, like, oh, maybe this is the friend that she was talking about. Oh, she's in New York, so that maybe is the Met Museum, etc. So there was always a dialogue between the dialogue and the ephemera, and I tried to support that in the design. So to wrap this up really quickly about the research, yeah, I had a lot of stuff. I found a ton of blog entries and these chat logs, but actually often I didn't take them word for word. I usually use them as a basis or heavily edited blog posts, for example, in order to put them in a game in a way that made sense, in a way that communicated something. It isn't all just literally stuff that I had on my hard drive. It isn't all literally things that I said. It's based on stuff that I found. It's almost like I remixed a lot of the stuff that I found that I had created over the course of my life so far. So the last thing I want to say is that the script, this is just a funny story that I wanted to share. The dialogue between Blake and Nina was pretty hard to write. So emotionally, in a way, because it was like, I don't know, you think about a breakup or something, it's like not that fun.
I couldn't even listen to it as I was making it. Like I would develop with the sound off because it was so awkward to listen to the last.
It's pretty cringy. Yeah, because it's like they're really awkward. It's like kind of a mess. But that's what it's about. It's about awkward teens basically having a relationship. So I wrote it at a bar called The West in Brooklyn over the course of 3 nights, and each night I would drink a ton of wine and write. And I finished an act a day, and that's how Sybil got written.
It got edited a lot, but
yeah.
That's how it got written.
So lots of wine. Okay.
Yeah, so I just want to talk about like some kind of more pragmatic takeaways that I had from this whole project, which was the first that I had spent more than a year making a project of any kind, let alone a game. Nina as well. I think that applies to everybody else that we worked with. So it was just like a huge learning experience for all of us. So the biggest thing that we probably learned from this is that scoping is really a hard skill that you have to practice. It's not just something that comes naturally to everybody. Like what I mean by that is figuring out the amount of work that you want to give yourself so that you don't, so that you're actually able to complete it in the time frame that you're looking for, and being able to, it's essentially the skill of estimating how long a piece of software is going to take to build rather. And after we spent the entire first weekend of this project just building the system that loads the map tiles in the background, kind of realized that we were going to have to reevaluate the entire scope of this thing. Like, we had bitten off way more than we could chew, essentially. All the games that we'd made up until that point had been really short projects around game jams. Like, they always took a week at most. And, we figured our plan for this game was straightforward enough that we could probably finish it in a similar amount of time. We ended up just being like super, super wrong about that. I think that we fell into this trap because the basic player interaction that we wanted seemed pretty simple. Point and click to attack enemies and explore this world while also exploring a mock computer desktop. It's like, there's nothing extremely technically challenging going on there, or so we thought. Felt like something we could build in a game jam or two. But the problem came, as it often does, in the little details. We wanted the levels to be very large, too big to fit in memory at once, so we had to build a map tiling system. We wanted an NPC to follow the player around, so we had to figure out how to do pathfinding and make nav meshes and all that stuff. And we wanted our artist, Rebecca, to have as much creative freedom as possible when she was designing the spaces. So we needed to implement pixel-perfect map collisions so that she didn't need to limit the shapes of the spaces that she could draw. And that and other details of the implementation is actually what took the most time. I mean, I'm sure any software engineer who's worked on a big project would tell you that it's the devil is always in the details with these bigger projects. This is just a kind of illustration of how much more work we had than we realized. This is a ordered listing of how many lines of code we wrote, and the total is about 17,000. Which, if you'd asked me to estimate at the beginning, I would have estimated a lot less than that. It doesn't even include the changes that we made to Flixel, which is the action script framework that we used, which were also pretty substantial. And my takeaway from this is that estimating how long any software project will take to build is a super hard problem because you often don't know what you'll need to do until you're already in the process of doing it. Half the process of even figuring out your true requirements are building the thing. And as a result of this bad estimate, we were essentially doing damage control for the entirety of the project. And we actually went a full month before we admitted to ourselves, or at least before I admitted to myself, that we couldn't finish the project in anywhere near our original estimate. And for months after, I had this nagging feeling that we were somehow behind schedule. And this is a result of our estimates just being so far off.
I feel like every other month I was like, we're gonna release it next
Oh,
month.
Yeah, I mean, it added a ton of stress. It added like a ton of stress because we were always like, oh yeah, we're really close, right? And then we would realize some new thing that we weren't quite, that was going to take way longer than we expected, and that was just the beginning of it. But what I learned is, we know a bit more about what is actually simple, what's actually complicated, and how much we can personally get done in a given time frame that we just didn't learn working on like smaller stuff that only takes a weekend. So.
And to start smaller.
Oh yeah, I mean, I mentioned it before, but our ideas for the beginning were just gigantic, and we ended up cutting, probably 80% of the features that we originally said we were going to have. We cut them, and the game was still huge from a code perspective because the stuff that we did want was just way more complicated than we initially realized. In addition to all these scope challenges and stuff, we also had to deal with a big shift in the way that we worked with our collaborators when we ended up moving across the country halfway through the project, which I wouldn't recommend. This is the team, the core team that worked on the game. It's Nina, Rebecca, me, Decky, and Sam, the video producer. And halfway through our work on this project, we moved from Brooklyn to Portland for Nina to start at Fulbright, like I mentioned. And we'd been working up until that point co-located with Rebecca and Decky. Most weekends we would meet at one of their apartments, and transitioning from that to distributed work ended up being like probably the biggest challenge of this whole thing. Obviously, when we're all physically present, collaboration is a lot more natural. So Rebecca's, for example, able to lean over and ask Nina what she thinks of the latest character design, and Nina can give feedback. Or, everybody's always aware of what the other people are working on because, you can just see it. And moving 3 time zones away just obviously changes this like crazy. We didn't have any idea what Rebecca and Decky were working on at any given time, and they didn't know how our latest feelings and thoughts about how things were going or what had changed about our plans. And I think personally that continuing in that manner without being smart about running our team, asynchronously essentially would have been a huge disaster, honestly. And luckily I'm interested, this is something that I'm kind of interested in because I work on a distributed team at my day job as a software engineer. So I was kind of interested in figuring out how we could do it better. So just, grain of salt for this part. I don't think that we did it nearly as well as we could have, but I did learn a lot from it, and I my takeaway from this is that the 2 most important ingredients for a successful distributed team are the people that you're working with have to be individually accountable for the stuff that they're responsible for, and you have to use co-working methods that are asynchronous rather than synchronous. So the difference would be, a phone call is synchronous mode of communication because both people have to be doing it at the exact same time to get any communication done, whereas email is asynchronous because one person can send it and then doesn't have to wait while the other person is responding. They can go do something else. And similarly, if everybody on your team isn't using like a shared chat room or something like that, the people that are probably aren't getting a very good value out of it because there's out-of-band communication that's occurring, which makes it very hard to work in this manner, we found. We tried using this thing called Trello, which maybe a lot of people here are familiar with, which I really like for my day job. The original idea was to create tasks and assign them to the team. Yeah, there's some funny stuff on there. The original idea was to create tasks and assign them to people, things like, do the World 2 art assets and assign it to Rebecca. And then she would work on it for a few weeks, and the key thing would be she would regularly post updates on the Trello task so that everybody else who's collaborating asynchronously could be updated about what she was doing if they wanted to. It was opt-in, see what Rebecca's up to. And that's how it worked. That's worked really well for me in the past with other software engineers and people that are used to working on really like structured stuff like this. But I noticed a lot of friction trying to get an artist or just like less technically minded people to work in such a rigid framework because something didn't feel right about it to both Rebecca and Decky, and they just hated using Trello. They never did it. They never used our Bitbucket issues, and pretty soon after asking them to, I was like, yeah, it's not worth like forcing you to do something that you hate. So we had to figure out a different way, and what we settled on basically is suboptimal. It was basically us sending out email updates every once in a while, being like, here's what we're working on, here's like the latest changes we made, and here's how, hope your part of it is going well also, let us know, kind of thing. It ended up being really tough in that way. Like we made it work, but I definitely don't recommend working in that manner.
I think it's important to note also that while we were working on this, it's not like we are a studio or anything. We were just a group of friends working on this together. So we all had outside stuff going on. So that I think also contributed to it being hard to adhere to a very rigid structure in how we were working, because the nature of how we were working, because of all of our outside stuff that was going on, just made that really hard. Because Rebecca would suddenly have, a commission to do or something, and that would change her whole schedule for a while. So there was just a lot of volatile stuff going on because of the fact that we were all working so many jobs at the same time.
Yeah, my single biggest takeaway from this is that if you have to be in this situation where your collaboration method has to drastically change, try as best you can to figure out with everybody before the change actually happens what you all want your collaboration to look like, because this mainly came from a mismatch of what they thought it was going to be like to work on this project and what we wanted it to be like. We were basically working every weekend, full-time on the weekends kind of thing, and they were looking at it more as a contract thing, and just difference of expectations caused a bit of unnecessary friction, I think, and ended up being a gigantic contributor to our burnout. I don't agree in general with the idea that doing insane overtime hours or crunch time is strictly necessary to make great software, but I found the opposite to be true. People that are doing thought-based work often benefit from having a clear head and keeping reasonable hours. But the entire time that we were working on Civil, we didn't have that luxury because we had full-time jobs and we were also doing multiple other side projects at the same time.
I was working on 4 games at the same time at one point.
Yeah, it was bad. It was real bad.
Yeah.
There was a roughly 6-month period where we didn't spend a single weekend not working on a video game, usually Sybil, but actually other stuff as well. We did not have the luxury of keeping reasonable hours, and we found out that there's a pretty fine line between working a lot on something you care about and actually hurting yourself for it, and obviously crossing that line can have very real consequences. After spending 8 hours a day writing Sybil code on a weekend, it's harder to come back on a Monday to my day job and have the mental energy and focus that I need to devote to that. And we lived together at the time, and we still do, and spending all of our time together just sitting silently across from each other working on laptops definitely put a strain on our relationship. I think that's just a real thing. So there maybe wasn't a ton we could do to avoid that situation, because we did both have full-time jobs and we wanted to finish the game before the end of 2015. We probably could have been nicer to ourselves in the process, I think. Artificial deadlines just create a crunch period. My philosophy is always, as much as possible, to avoid imposing a deadline that's not defined strictly by the natural completion time of the software. But I understand that that's pretty at odds with the reality of shipping a game on Steam, because you need to have a launch date and stuff like that. So it works better in a situation where if you're making a web app or something like that, where you can just kind of continuously deploy to it. But I think the only reliable way to avoid this crunch situation is to avoid the artificial deadlines entirely, which is just obviously not feasible, but it's maybe something that I aspire to avoid artificial deadlines when possible. And the one kind of last sort of pragmatic thing that I want to talk about was why did we use Flash for this game? This game was entirely made in Flash. We did it mainly because we used ActionScript on all of our previous games, including How Do You Do It and Ladylike and everything else. Flixel, the ActionScript framework that we use, makes it really easy to get 2D prototypes up and running quickly, and you can also deploy them really easily to the internet, which served us really, really well in game jams. We actually started off doing a game maker prototype, and we scrapped that almost immediately because I could not stand to as a programmer who I want to just get in there and write. Anything that confuses me, I want to just fix it myself, and the game maker really, really doesn't allow you to do that. So that made it hard for me to work on it. And also it didn't support full motion video, which we needed, which was a requirement for us. So given that requirement, our choices were basically Flash, Unity Pro, which neither of us knew and was paid, or some C++ or Java thing where we use an open source cross-platform video player, which is probably not reliable and really bug prone and difficult and stuff. So given those choices, Flash seems really natural. We already know it. supports Windows, deploys everywhere. This seemed all right. And for me, creating this game was essentially a long process of discovering that Flash was only barely the right tool for this job. The crunch time that I spent at the end finding memory leaks would probably have been avoided if we hadn't been using Flash. So most of the big inefficiencies that I found were caused by that map loading system I mentioned, loading these gigantic images and unloading them on the fly, and all the collision system, which also did like a lot of image-based stuff. And Flash is not particularly efficient at doing that. So for each, to get like slightly technically here, not too deep, for each pixel perfect collision check, we basically had to make a new in-memory copy of the map tile and also the player tile, and then like do some overlapping math to compare them. In Java or something, or in C++, I would have had full control over that process, and I would have been able to optimize the parts that were inefficient, but ActionScript hides a lot of it from you. So we ended up being stuck with this like way inefficient thing that we couldn't touch, and we had to fix it with heuristics, like do less collisions and stuff like that. And we every possible way to cut corners on the collision stuff and the map loading stuff, we had to figure out how to do it because the game would not run at a reasonable frame rate otherwise. And it would also crash. Like, you couldn't get through the whole game without these random memory leaks coming up. And I was like, I'm pretty sure I didn't write memory leaks. And I actually discovered, like, yeah, the image data in ActionScript is not garbage collected. You have to remove it from memory yourself, which was a really fun discovery like 3 weeks before we were going to release the thing. Luckily, I figured it out. We had a really awesome collection of testers who would just play it over and over and find these bugs for us. It was amazing. So yeah, I would strongly caution anybody who wants to use ActionScript for a project of this scale, if it's going to have anything more than like an extremely trivial memory requirement, just especially for image data, just for all those reasons. And this is an image of Sybil running under the profiler Adobe Scout, which is actually a great reason to use Flash. It's a really good tool. And that big green jump in the graph happens when you go into a level that uses the map tile loading system. That jump used to be like 3 times as large, and it would crash the game within minutes. And the crunch time at the end was basically the process of getting that thing as low as possible, so that it wouldn't like explode by the time you finished the end of the hour-long game. Despite all this stuff, I still don't regret using ActionScript at all. Like, I don't think it was the perfect tool, but I think it was the right decision at the time that we made it. I think we made it for all the right reasons.
Especially because we both knew it, so we could both write code for it and had shipped games using it before, and challenge is making a game of this scope and learning a new tool. That would have been too much for us, yeah. So we had to go with something that we were familiar with.
It would have been way too much. Our goal was to ship a game that worked, and we met that goal with tools that we knew and how to use, and I feel really good about that. People come up to us all the time and ask, like, oh, why'd you write this in Flash? It seems like a horrible idea. And I was like, yeah, I know.
Okay, so this is sort of our last couple things, mostly about releasing the game. So last summer, we were working like crazy to finish Cibele. We were really burned out and basically wanted to be done with it. So I started to aggressively plan like the release of it. Which is when, the Trello slide is gone, but it said a thing that released the fucking game now. That was like when I was like in that phase. So I started to aggressively plan the release, and earlier in the year, I had gotten us some nice preview coverage on Polygon, which was cool, and had shared some early builds at events, and had gone to show it around a little bit earlier in the year. So we had that push. So people kind of knew about it, but not enough yet. So I knew I needed to do a really big press push right before it came out so that anyone would know that the game exists. So basically I decided that we would go to PAX in Seattle, which I didn't have a pass for, and I was just like, okay, we're just gonna go because I know a bunch of press people are gonna be in town, and I'm just gonna try emailing them and seeing if I can set up meetings with them. I had never done this before, and I was just like, I'm gonna try this. So I did, and I got meetings with a bunch of outlets, and I basically asked them all to meet with me in random hotel lobbies of hotels that I wasn't actually staying at, which works really well. No one cares.
It's a great place
just so
to meet.
You know, yeah. It's really good, and it was comfortable, and I had my laptop, and I'd like sit them down in the fancy chair like I own the place. So I had a lot of really good meetings with IGN, GameSpot, Giant Bomb, and a bunch of really cool sites, and they wrote really nice preview coverage of this first act of the game, which was the preview build that I showed them. It was basically from the start to the end of the first act. That was it. So that was the surge of attention that I felt like we really needed in order to ride sort of this wave of people knowing about it to release. So after that sort of preview coverage happened, I really picked a release date, which was November 2nd. And basically I made that decision, one, because it was about a month after that preview coverage, so people would still kind of be aware of it and it would be sort of in the back of their minds. And Fallout was coming out a week later, and I didn't want to compete with that.
It worked pretty well because everybody was going to be glued to the game news sites waiting for like Fallout news because it was coming out a week later. So if they're featuring Sybil, it's like, oh, cool, it's ready.
So that was like why we picked November 2nd. And this is just a screenshot of like the not press release, but like the email that I sent to all the press and my friends and stuff with a copy of the game ahead of time to, you know, try and get people to talk about it, because that's what you should do if you want people to know that your game exists and to buy it. So I was doing that, and I cut off the bottom because it was a Steam key. And then release day came around, which was November 2nd, and it was pretty terrifying, but also super exciting. So this is a tweet, from that day. So launch went almost perfectly, except for one panic attack that I had after I realized that I'd messed up a launch discount on Steam, which I thankfully got fixed within an hour of launching, and then everything went smoothly, but I was freaking out.
The Steam hack is if you've got a Steam representative who's not responding to you, email their boss.
Yeah.
And then they'll respond to you.
I was freaking out. It was really bad, but we fixed it and everything went really smoothly and it was super exciting. Oops.
Go back.
Why did that do that? Okay, so we were really fortunate to be able to make a game that a lot of people enjoyed and connected with. And that day that we released it, it was exciting. Like my friend Adam actually streamed it the day it came out, so that was like the thing we did when it first came out. We watched my friend stream it for the first time, and like he was really into it, so it was like really encouraging, and he didn't run into any bugs, even though we were like super afraid that he would. So we kind of watched that, and we're like, I think Steve brought us kolaches or donuts or something, I don't know. So it was sort of like, it was a day, it was interesting. But people really connected with it right away. So I had all sorts of people emailing me to tell me personally that they had been in an online relationship, they had friends that had dated online, they had met someone on AIM chat room or IRC or World of Warcraft or whatever, and all these people just emailing me to be like, oh my God, this exact same thing happened to me, or I know someone who this has happened to. So they felt that the game was very real to them in that way, which was really cool. And I had some other people telling me that it offered them a new perspective that they hadn't considered before because they hadn't been in an online relationship, or they felt like it wasn't part of their, people are always like, it's not my generation, or it's not this or not that. But they felt like they could get a window into that experience through Sybil, which was a really nice thing to hear as the designer. That was really cool. And I think my favorite email that I got about Sybil was from a 17-year-old girl who said, and I quote, "I'm 17 and I'm really not sure what love is yet, but I feel closer to knowing after playing this." And she even wrote me a poem, and it was just like the sweetest thing ever. It was so cute. So making and releasing Sybil has been a pretty powerful experience. And then we went to the IGF and won the New Love Award, which is what that picture is of. So that was super insane, and it was just a big emotional roller coaster. Thank you. And yeah, it feels crazy to have released it, especially after like all the stuff we've been talking to you about like burning out, working on 4 games at once, working at full-time jobs, struggling to figure out how to collaborate remotely. It really felt like every second like we wouldn't ship the game ever.
Yeah, we tried to, not get too like deep into the gory details of it, but there was a lot of emotional turmoil that went into making this. So
yeah.
it feels really good to be able to come out on the other side of it with some lessons that we've learned, I guess.
And feeling like we're proud of what we did.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's how Sybil was made. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
One note before Q&A, by the way. I didn't talk too much about the design stuff, but I just want to let people know in case they are interested in the design of Sybil. I gave a talk at GDC. It was entitled "How to Embodying 19-Year-Old Nina something." I think if you go to ninasays.so/GDC 2015, I have links to the talk, and it's a really in-depth breakdown based basically on my master's thesis. So if you want to learn more about the design of Sybil and my process with that, that's a resource if you're curious. But yeah, I guess Q&A time? Cool.
Yeah.
Anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I guess as far as the transition goes, I guess, yeah, so about halfway through working on Sybil, we moved here and I started working on Tacoma. So we weren't done. So the transition, I was working on Sybil while working on Tacoma for a really long time. So that was a thing.
One of the things that comes to mind is you've talked a lot in the past about your poetry mindset and storytelling mindset in general being just really focused on mundane details of everyday life, and like that definitely carries across from the design of Sybil to something like Tacoma, I think.
Yeah, basically, like, I guess as far as the literal transition, it was kind of crazy because I was working on many games at once and learning a ton about making Tacoma, which is a kind of game that I haven't made before. It's not personal to me, and it's 3D, first-person 3D, never worked in Unity. I was learning all this stuff, so that was crazy, while also trying to finish this, so that's one aspect to it. And also, in a lot of ways, working on Tacoma and working on Sybil are actually not very different because they're both about characters, and especially for me, when I'm working on a game like Sybil, it is very personal and it's based on personal stuff, but I get very quickly into that mindset of like, this is fiction and this is about a character, and I have to think about it that way so that I don't put my bias into the game. Like, I want to really write as honestly and clearly as possible, and a lot of that is distancing myself from the personal side of it and treating it very much like this like object that I'm shaping into a story. And so, you know, Tacoma is also very focused on story and on character, so a lot of the same skills of like looking at characters closely and like also honest real life characters. That's something that, you know, Tacoma is about human people like Sybil is, even though the contexts are very different. So I think there's actually a lot of overlap, especially when I think about how I work on both of them, and how I think about the stories in both of them. Yes?
You mentioned editing some of the old blog posts and texts and emails from your old computer. Could you talk a little more about the types of edits that you made? Was it about condensing? Was it about picking the right details? What's sort of the gist of the editing?
Sure. So I guess I'll use an example. I had an old live journal, and I had written a bunch of posts about when I bought Final Fantasy X-2. So I was like 14 or something, and it was these like blog posts, and I would be like talking about hanging out with my friends and playing the game and like buying it, and they were like these long posts written by a kid who was just rambling basically. So that's not having like a long rambly post would be true to a certain kind of experience, but probably not very interesting to the player, on top of the fact that the text in the game, we didn't have scroll bars for everything, so we had to have text fit in like a box basically, so everything had to be really concise. So I would basically take that blog post about Final Fantasy X-2 and take out like sort of the gems or the parts that I thought were either really interesting or funny or really said something clear about the character in the story. So for that Final Fantasy X-2 one, I think I just, I forget actually what I cut out of that one, but
Oh, I don't know
maybe that was a bad
about
example.
specifics.
I can't remember.
No, I mean it was kind of a process of collaging more than anything. Like you take a just big body of stuff where there's some gems in it, like you said, and just cut out the best parts essentially, put them next to each other, and kind of craft a post out of it or whatever.
Yeah, I remember now. One of the parts was about how like my friends were over to play it, and like my parents got into a fight, and I like described myself as like, I was like, I felt like nothing or something. It was like super dramatic. But that moment was like in a much larger post, and I was like, this is important because it's about like how the character grew up, and like this maybe explains why she has some self-esteem issues, which you kind of see in the game. So I took that part of the blog post out to support that character detail later. So yeah, a lot of like cutting things out and editing. There's only a couple things that I really took verbatim from blog posts and stuff. It was pretty rare. I usually just used them as a base and edited very heavily. And for the dialogue, I think there was maybe only one sentence I took from an actual like chat log that I'd screenshotted that I didn't edit because it was so good. I won't say what it is though because it's embarrassing for the person.
Okay, well, I mean, you put it in the game. I feel
I
like you
know,
can
but
say it, so.
I don't want to say it. Anyways, yes.
Going into it, did you have any expectations about sales, and did that end up matching with reality, or what did that?
Yeah, so this is the first game that I have ever sold. Emmett actually sold a game before me.
I sold the game through Adult Swim. They published it, But this was a very different situation because we were totally self-publishing, doing everything ourselves.
So it was my first experience doing this kind of thing, and I basically, because I was a student at the time and I was working at Kickstarter and the Department of Education at various points in this project early on, I had income to support myself outside of the game. So I was like, I want to try selling it because people tell me that it's impossible to sell vignette games. That's what they say to me, but I don't believe that. So I was kind of like, okay, well, maybe I'll take this opportunity to like have this be, because I felt really confident that the project would have a large enough scope that I could personally justify selling it, because I think I had a little bit of imposter syndrome, like, oh, my games are too small to be sold or whatever, because that's what people kept telling me. And I think slowly over the course of the few months at the beginning of the project, I was like, wait, maybe I don't have to listen to those people, and I can try and sell it and treat this as an experiment and just see how it goes.
Yeah, I remember there being a little bit of doubt at the beginning whether or not we would end up selling it or whether it would be free, and it kind of became clear once we realized what we wanted to make that it was something that we could sell. But I also remember we didn't have any specific financial goals, or I didn't even really have any expectations personally. I was like, we're gonna sell this, and if anybody buys it, that's cool, and it'll be available for people to play. And we, made a small amount of money for an indie game, but like we made a decent amount of sales, which is pretty sweet.
More than we expected.
Yeah, definitely more than we expected. Like it wasn't like we fell short by any big margin or anything like that.
But we don't have enough money to like.
Oh no, we don't have money to do anything. We could get like GDC passes with the money that we made.
It was more than that. We made a good amount for what I expected, which was interesting because it really was just an experiment. Even like picking the price, like I asked so many people for advice because I was like, I just have no idea how to price a game like this. Like, what does it even mean?
It's really funny because we asked like 3 or 4 people that were all very knowledgeable and had done it before, and their answers were just all so different. So we picked a number that was right in the middle of all of them.
And no one has batted an eyelash at the cost. I've never had anyone approach me personally about it being too expensive.
People on Steam forums have,
maybe.
aside from that, they don't count. Yeah,
they're fine. They'll be fine. But yeah, so it really was very much an experiment, and I was constantly going to people who know better than me for advice through the whole process. And I think that, without people like Steve or Bennett or people who had actually done this kind of thing before, we wouldn't have done nearly as well, because I just took so much advice from them because I had never sold a game before. And having a mentor or mentors is so helpful if you haven't done something like set up your Steam account to sell a game, because it's just so many complicated things that come up and you can't necessarily Google for all of them or whatever. So having mentors helps.
By the way, when we say Bennett, we're talking about Bennett Foddy, the guy who made QWOP and worked on Sports Friends as well. He's like been an awesome mentor for Nina and helped us a lot through this process as well.
He's my favorite person. But yeah, so it was all a big experiment, and it turned out better than expected.
Does anyone have any other questions they'd like to ask?
Sorry. What was it like releasing a game that's so female-centric in a post-gamer world?
So for me personally, like I was really lucky and weirdly never got targeted or anything by any of that stuff. It barely affected me. I guess it affected me in that my friends were in terrible situations and it was horrible, and I would like, try to support them in whatever ways that I could without putting myself at risk. So I never was really negatively impacted by it, other than, there's obviously lots of crappy Steam commenters or people tweeting at me who are mean, but like, I don't know, that's just reality, and it's never been that bad for me to like scare me or anything like that. So I actually have gotten way more positive reactions and support from people about Sybil. I can't think of really anything really bad that came.
Yeah, the main
from
thing
that.
is just that it's a little bit annoying and disappointing to be interviewed by somebody who's asking, "What's it like to be a woman in the games industry?" or something like that. It's just like, all right, you've talked about it enough. I know that you don't want to talk about it anymore because it's a little bit like you don't want to just be the token woman in the games industry. You want to just talk about your work and your design process and stuff. And like, that's not, this game wasn't made to make a statement about that situation at all. And people kind of sometimes see it as that, right?
Yeah, so it's definitely, especially in like the way media talks about the game, that's definitely the issue of women in games and stuff has affected the way people talk about Sybil. But there's also, I don't know, there's definitely a lot there that I don't fully understand, but I don't feel the impact directly. I know that it definitely affects the dialogue around the game, but not in a way that I can really control and not in a way that necessarily hurts it.
Yeah, I think it says, Sybil says something useful about that situation if you contextualize it in that way, but I think we don't like to talk about it too much in that light just because it's not the point for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Any more questions? Yes.
So feel free to say nothing as the answer to this, but is there anything interesting or relevant or that you want to talk about the 2-hour gameplay Steam refund thing?
Oh man, that's like the one thing I ever got attacked about, actually. Because I said one thing about it. I don't really have much to say about it other than I don't think games should be defined in any way based on their playtime, because you look at a game, like a fighting game, how long is a fighting game?
Like,
I don't know.
I get it. I get it from Steam's perspective. It's
Yeah.
a hard problem because you want to be able to offer people refunds, but there's this problem of games like Cibele and games like How Do You Do It and stuff. I'm not saying it's easy. I think that the first solution they came up with was bad from a personal perspective, but it hasn't
hurt us.
It's not affecting us that much because we're not surviving off of the game, so our perspective is kind of limited in that way. We're not, it's not our single source of income, but
And also, we can see the refunds, and like, it's not like everyone's refunding the game. Like, it's still a very small percentage for us, but may depend from game to game. You just don't know. I don't know what the experience is for other developers, so.
yeah, it's okay.
Anybody else?
Because if that's all, we can call it. Right?
Yeah.
Cool.
Cool. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. Great.